Ye gentlemen and ladies fair who grace this famous city, just listen if you've time to spare while I rehearse a ditty. And for the opportunity, conceive yourselves quite lucky, for 'tis not often that you see a hunter from Kentucky, oh Kentucky, the hunters of Kentucky, oh Kentucky, the hunters of Kentucky. We are a hardy, free-born race, each man to fear a stranger. Whate'er the game, we join in chase, despising time and danger. And if a daring foe annoys, whate'er his strength and forces, we'll show him that Kentucky boys are alligator horses. Oh, Kentucky, the hunters of Kentucky. Oh, Kentucky, the hunters of Kentucky. I suppose you've read it in the Prince, how Pakenham attempted to make old Hickory Jackson wince, but soon his scheme repented. For we with rifles ready cocked thought such occasion lucky, and soon around the general flock the hunters of Kentucky, oh Kentucky, the hunters of Kentucky, oh Kentucky, the hunters of Kentucky. You've heard, I suppose, how New Orleans is famed for wealth and beauty. There's girls of every hue, it seems, from snowy white to sooty. So Pakenham, he made his brags, if he in fight was lucky, he'd have their girls and cotton bags in spite of oh Kentucky, the hunters of Kentucky, oh Kentucky, the hunters of Kentucky. But Jackson, he was wide awake and was
We
not
saw
slow
last
to
time
rifles, for well he knew what
the,
the
the
enemy
origins
meant
of
by his trusty
democracy,
rifles.
which Tocqueville
He
traces
never stopped
back
to
to the
fight or walk
Puritans.
the ground
Let's
with his
consider
own
now
two
its
feet. There
development
stood John Bull
leading up to
Southern
about his
Cross, and
time,
here was old
and certainly in
Kentucky,
our
oh
time.
Kentucky,
What were the
the hunters
steps
of
in its growth
Kentucky, oh Kentucky,
following its
the
origin?
hunters of
This is
Kentucky.
the Hunters of
The
Kentucky,
bank was raised
popular
by the
song
English
about the War of
when he thought of
1812
dying.
and the famous
But
Battle of New
Buffaloes like
Orleans
to
in
rest on their
1814,
tails flying.
when Andrew Jackson and his small band of American troops held off thousands of invading British. It really was a moment of national awakening for the Americans. This realization that not only could democracy sustain itself under the Constitution, but it could also fight a war of self-defense against a British invasion. And it did it quite well. What a huge boost of confidence this was by the time that war ended. This was, of course, the time the Star Spangled Banner was written, where the Stars and Stripes for the first time became a broad national symbol. It had been there before, as we know. But now this sort of patriotic fervor and the realization that we, the people, are doing it. We're doing it on our own, finally emerges. So let's consider Tocqueville's assessment of that, and what he thinks of the future of democracy and where this development is headed. And then, of course, next time we'll tie it together with his major worries and concerns about what he calls tyranny of the majority. But yeah, first, let's consider a few things in chapters 3 and 4, as well as 8 of Democracy in America. Turn to that today. And again, last time he talked about the transition away from aristocracy into democracy, which actually had origins way, way back in the Middle Ages, which is really surprising. But he looked at the church and he looked at um, the way that kings would often appeal to the people, the way that civil law started to regard citizens broadly as individuals. And then, of course, how the Puritans brought that to its fullness in New England and set the tone for much of the future republic. Well, what were the major steps in American history more recently that seemed to give way from aristocracy to democracy? And what was it about the aristocratic elements that surrendered and that gave over their power and their privilege? What was the breakdown of aristocracy specifically on our shores and the assurance that it would never really come back, at least not in the form that it was in the old world? Well, first of all, he points out that there was a fraudulent aristocracy, and there is as he's writing, and that's, of course, in the South. Slaveholders often saw themselves as neo-aristocrats in some ways. They liked American democratic traditions in a broad sense, but it conflicted with their sense of honor. Being a plantation owner puts you in the upper crust of Southern society. And so they would very often see themselves as like knights and dukes and lords reborn, but they were frauds. The slave system rested on violence, right, and terror and brutality. Slaves were regarded as property. And by the end of the 1830s, they started to be looked at as not even human. That's never the way it was in the relationship between serfs and lords back in old Europe. It was more of an agreement, more of a contract between them. Slaves never entered this agreement at all. They were forced into it. And so, in that way, Tocqueville points out that so much of slaveholding classes kind of fooled themselves into thinking that they were aristocracy reborn. And even though they held on to these notions of honor and their own unique privilege, it just wasn't the same. There was nothing honorable about them when it came to their relationship with their slaves or with the rest of the country, really. So he'll come back to that. He'll have a lot more to say about the South. But more importantly, what happened with the founding? I remember he believed the true founders were the Puritans, as we said, but he had a lot to say too about the American founders themselves. And the fact that they gathered in Philadelphia in 1787, like we talked about, drafted that Constitution and decided to declare right up front who the sovereign would be. And guess who it was? We the people. Opening line of the Constitution. Tremendous deference to the American people by the founders, starting with the Revolution and then going on into the days of ratifying the Constitution. And so, how is it that they put so much trust into the people in such a way? Why would they do that? When the revolution came, it led to a very clear sense that the people really are the sovereign. And in fact, they have been all along. And so we should defer to them. So we'll think more about that. But he says, though, that the third and most important thing of all, and he spends the rest of the chapter really meditating on this, is something that, as he points out, is something that a lot of historians and even scholars of America have not entirely recognized its importance. And that is the change in inheritance laws. Not at the federal level. This was never a Congress decision. It was always in the colonial governments and then later when they became states. What did they do? It was required under law that if an old patriarch died and he had any substantial amount of wealth or estate or whatever, property, he had to divide it up among his children, all of them. And in some cases, that even included daughters. So if the old patriarch has, $10 million and he has 10 kids, each one gets $1 million, all divided up evenly under state law, not the oldest son. And that had been the tradition from time immemorial, going all the way back to Jacob and Esau. And remember, one selling his inheritance to the other. Yeah, that it had always been understood that the old father took whatever he had and he gave it to his oldest son, and it would pass from one generation to the next, to the next, to the next. And that's how it had been throughout medieval Europe. The oldest son was automatically the favorite. What about the other brothers? Well, they lose, right? Maybe they can bum around the castle. Maybe if the older brother feels generous, he'll share some of the wealth with his brothers if he likes them. What about the daughters? They get married off, right? The father just marries them off to form social ties with other patriarchs. So that's just how it was. Oldest father to oldest son, sorry, father to oldest son, father to oldest son, for generations and generations, the estate would pass. The fact that Americans decided to end that and require within their state laws that property be divided up among sons, Tocqueville says, is immensely important. And it deserves a tremendous amount of attention and recognition for what it did for American democracy. What did it do? Let's consider it in detail here. What are the effects of these inheritance laws in the states? Land takes on a whole new meaning in the new republic. It ceases to be a source of power as it had been back in old medieval France and England and Germany and all over Europe, and really any feudal society, where land really is the basis of aristocratic power. Here's an old map of France on the eve of the French Revolution, as it had been since way, way back in the Middle Ages. These were all fiefdoms. These were all the land of the dukes and the lords, and they were huge. I mean, this is vast swath of territory. What did they do with that land? They usually hunted on it. It was reserved entirely for the family and the hunt. But as a result, what happened to all kinds of other people? If you worked on the manor, if you worked for the Lord as a serf, okay, you were fine. You knew your place. Or maybe you had some industrial skill and you brought it to one of the towns or the bigger cities of the Middle Ages. But anybody who couldn't do that was completely shut out. And so you had just masses of displaced people who were not feudal lords, who were not able to work for the feudal lords were not able to find their way into the cities and towns, and so they were just shut out completely and just lived in total squalor and poverty and desperation. And it just got worse and worse over the history of France. What a different story it is in the United States. Do you see property, like private property lines drawn this way or this big? Not at all. Here's one of the first little settlements in the state of Ohio along the Ohio River. What's different about them? They are much, much smaller. Each one of these is a little plot designed by an Ohio company. It was called the Ohio Company that was in charge of development of land for private property and houses and farms and things like that. And it was determined by federal law early on under the Northwest Ordinance that each of these plots of land would be small. No monopolies could come in and buy them all up, nor could families own huge swaths of land anymore. Of course, today all that's long gone. People can own large pieces of land, but still they're always for sale and they're not held in the same set of hands across multiple generations in the same way. So what happens? Opportunity, industry, a chance for everybody to own a little bit of private property and invest in it, watch it appreciate as it develops, and then sell it or not. It's up to the private property owner. Thomas Jefferson gives us an insight into this era as he was in France on the eve of its revolution, and he took one look at that map and said that's a total abomination. He wrote back to James Madison in 1785, just a couple years before the convention, and he said, "The solitude of my walk," as he's walking across the French countryside observing all this, "the solitude of my walk led me into a train of reflections on that unequal division of property, which occasions the numberless instances of wretchedness, poverty, which I have observed in this country, and is to be observed all over Europe." Now, as far as unequal division in terms of wealth, well, that can't be helped. But the fact that this is unequal because some families just claim property as their own for no other reason than just because they want it for hunting is profoundly unjust. He says the property of this country is absolutely centered in a few hands of the nobles, having revenue from 500,000 guineas a year downward. Some people are employed as servants, as he points out, and laborers and domestics, and then, of course, husbandmen, all the farmers who work in the manor, as it had been since way back in the Middle Ages. But other than that, but after all these comes the most numerous of all the classes. That is the poor who cannot find work. And so I ask myself, why? What could be the reason that so many should be permitted to beg who are willing to work in a country where there is very few considerable proportion of uncultivated lands? What if the French government divided up all those lands into equal shares like they did over in Ohio, right? And allowed each individual French citizen to mortgage it if they need to and work their land and cultivate their own private property? There would be opportunity for all. Poverty would go way, way down. But the nobles don't want to let it go, right? So, for that reason, Jefferson was all in favor of the French Revolution when it came, and he was the only American founder who was. Of course, he changed his mind later when he found out what a terror it turned out to be, like we talked about before. But he had a point here, didn't he? It ought to be the business of government ensuring that pursuit of happiness, call it, that desire for improving one's station and making things better. Inheritance laws achieved that in the United States, Tocqueville said, fulfilled what Jefferson hoped would happen. But what else does it do? That's land and property, but it has an effect, as Tocqueville says, on the very soul of people. What does he say about its impact across time into the future? Think about this across generations and what effect it has on people. It causes economic mobility. It allows for people to rise up out of poverty instead of just sit there like peasants in the old world. Are there very rich in America? Yes. Are there very poor? Yes. But what's the difference between the rich and the poor here and places like old Europe? People are rising and falling on the scale, as he points out. And so there's opportunity to get out of poverty. There's also the risk of losing your fortune and sinking into poverty, though you've been rich. And as a result, everything is churning up and down the scale of class. and nobody is stuck. Everybody has a way out. As he says, as he puts it on page 38 in the middle, or below the middle. English legislation respecting the transfer of property was abolished in almost all the states at the time of the Revolution. The law of entail, that's what it is, the law that requires that equal distribution of inheritance. The law of entail was modified in such a way as to hinder only in an imperceptible manner the free circulation of property of wealth. The first generation passed away, and the earth began to be divided. The movement became more and more rapid as time passed. Again, people getting rich, people getting poor, but everybody kind of going both directions, right? Nobody's stuck. The poor are not stuck in desperation. The rich don't just sit on the top. It's everybody trading places across generations. Today, when scarcely a sixth year has passed, right? It takes a few months. The aspect of society, sorry, I said that wrong. When 60 years has passed, the aspects of society is already unrecognizable since the founding. And almost all the families of the great landowners have sunk into the common mass. The state of New York, where there were a great number of them, two of them barely linger above the abyss that has already seized them. The sons of these opulent citizens are today merchants, lawyers, doctors. They go on and, do pretty well for themselves, but they do it because of their hard work, because of their dedication and their careers. That's completely different from being rich because you just inherit it from your dad, from your grandfather, going back generations. They earn it, they maintain it, or in some cases they don't, and they just blow it. Most of them have fallen into the most profound obscurity. The last traces of ranks and of hereditary distinction is destroyed, and the law of inheritance has everywhere completely accomplished its task in America. It's not that in the United States as elsewhere there are no rich. In fact, I do not know of a country where the love of money occupies a larger place in the human heart than in America, and where a more profound contempt of professed for the theory of the permanent equality of property. He'll have more to say about class and materialism. But, he says, wealth circulates there with an incredible rapidity, and experience teaches that it is rare to see two generations receive its favors. So yeah, people rise to the top and get very rich, but it doesn't usually last more than one or two generations. And what's amazing is some of the wealthiest Americans in our history, they've been intentional about that. Was it Andrew Carnegie who said, "Him who dies rich dies a fool," right? And left actually very little inheritance to his kids on purpose because he wanted them to make their own way. He didn't want them to just mooch off of his fortune. He wanted to see them improve their lot. As a result of this, people often turn to the ways of making wealth just through their own grit and hard work. So, yeah, you get bankers and investors and stuff like that. But then more often, what you get are self made men, the hardworking, determined middle class laborer who picks up an industrial trade, the blacksmith, the tanner, the butcher, or other industrial trades, the plumber, perhaps, as plumbing develops, or more technical skills when the railroad comes along, stuff like that. People find trades and they become these self-made middle-class people. They work hard, they're frugal, they save, they pay their debts, and off they go as this happy, prosperous middle class. And as we'll see, that middle class uh, set of values and mentality is really important for a thriving democracy. He'll have a lot more to say about them. So the fortune gets divided. The kids each take their share. Some invest, some save and they're frugal. One brother, gets together with another brother and they become joint stockholders or they start a company together, merging their fortunes or whatever. But then others feel a little more adventurous. While the others are more frugal and simple, the rest take another brother takes his fortune, he buys a covered wagon and a team of mules, and he goes west, right? You have people who have little attachment to place because of these laws. Being part of the home and the family and all that just doesn't mean as much as it did in the old world, in that sense of family honor and belonging and, the manor and the castle and all that. There is none of that in America. And so as a result, another brother takes his inheritance, his little share of it, and goes west with it and tries his luck out there. And so westward expansion as Tocqueville says, is a result of this on page 39. At the end of the last century, he says, daring adventurers began to penetrate the valleys of the Mississippi and then beyond, right? This was like a new discovery of America. Soon the majority of the immigrants went there. One then saw unknown societies emerge all of a sudden from the wilderness. Places like Bismarck, North Dakota, perhaps. No, that came later. But states whose very name did not yet exist a few years earlier took their place within the American Union. Places like Ohio and Indiana and Michigan, those parts of federal territory at the time. In these states, improvements in the way by chance and the inhabitants arrived only yesterday on the soil they occupy. He mentions elsewhere that when he visited Ohio, he found that most of the people who lived there had not been born there. Right? A minority were natives to that state. They barely know each other, and each is ignorant of his neighbor's past history. In this part of the American continent, the population, therefore, escapes not only the influence of great names and great riches, but the natural aristocracy, which flows from enlightenment and virtue, even. So, in the West, the society does not yet exist there. It's like that state of nature that Locke mentioned. So, westward expansion is a major part of this. Here's a very interesting map. The rates of travel between the year 1800 and the year 1830. How long did it take you to get out there? It would take you about 6 weeks to get as far as Illinois in 1800. Because of improved roads, because of better methods of transportation, and within 6 weeks, you can be clear up in future Minnesota, way on the outskirts of Wisconsin, almost to North Dakota, right? That'll take you more like 7 weeks, but still, you see this increase in travel and mobility. Americans are surprisingly mobile people. We sell houses, we sell off our property. It's funny if you read a lot of ancient history, selling your house was always kind of a shameful thing to do in ancient Rome. No, because it's the house of your fathers, right? Very often your ancestors would be buried in the front yard. And so why would you sell it? That's just disgraceful. Americans don't look at it that way though, right? Yeah, you buy a house, you raise your family in it, your kids grow up, and then what's your major concern? How do I hold on to my place and the memories here and everything? No, what can I get for it? What equity do I have? And people just hawk their houses just like that. And Americans just don't think much of it. They're mobile. They like to move around. They don't stay in one place much. And it's been that way for a very long time. But Tocqueville says this goes deeper than our habits. This goes all the way down to our intellect. And what kind of intellect do we have as a result of this breaking up of inheritances and the mingling of classes and people rising and falling on the social scale? Page 39, he says, what? We become very mediocre. How does he put it? I do not think that there is a country in the world where, in proportion to the population, there are as few ignorant persons and as few learned men than in America. We're not ignorant, but we're not enlightened either. We're in the middle. We're mediocre. Everybody's very, very literate in the United States, and yet nobody really reads much other than newspapers back in those days. Or today, right? Text messages and road signs. That's about all we read, right? Unless you go to UMary, then you read books because you're in my class. But otherwise, yeah, people really tend to turn to just, good enough is good enough when it comes to the intellect. So it is with reading, so it is with education in general. Primary education is within the reach of everybody, he says. Higher education is within the reach of almost no one. Maybe about like 6% of the US population went to college in these days. Much bigger today, but this, he says, is easy to understand, and it is, as it were, the necessary result of what we have suggested above. Almost all Americans are prosperous, and therefore they are able easily to get the first elements of human knowledge. In America, there are few rich men. Oops, sorry. In America, there are few rich men, and almost all Americans must therefore practice a profession. Now, every profession requires an apprenticeship. You got to learn the skill, the trade, right? The Americans are therefore only able to devote the first few years of life to the cultivation of intellect, like real study, real serious thoughts. But once you're about 15 years old, it's time to get a career back in those days. Therefore, their education thus most often ends at the moment where ours begins in France. People are more concerned not about lofty questions of theoretical truth or theology or philosophy or great works of literature. They are primarily concerned with present utility. How do I get rich? Right? Or how do I gain power and prestige? Tell me how. As far as the lofty theoretical stuff of history and philosophy and literature and theology, just give me the Wikipedia summary because it's so much easier, right? Why would I read this hard book when I can just watch a YouTube documentary that gives me the quick, easy summary? That's it. It's mediocre. Good enough is good enough. The information's out there if I really want to dig into it, but I don't have time. I like sensational things. I like exciting things. The breaking story in the newspaper, the, conspiracy theory, the rumor. What does this do to us, though? Do we have a much of a sense of leisure in America? The ability to be still and calm, the ability to meditate on a difficult question, important question. He says our taste for study just isn't there. We just have no time for it. We'll dedicate our minds very intensely to certain kinds of study if there's a really clear and immediate outcome. But that's it. If there's no use to what we study, then we seem to see no point in it. There is therefore, he says, no class in America in which the taste for intellectual pleasures is passed on with inherited prosperity and leisure, and which honors the work of the intellect. Just not there, he says. In consequence, the will as well as the ability to devote oneself to this work is lacking. In America, there is a certain common level of human knowledge that's been established. All minds approach it, some by rising, others by falling. One thus encounters an immense multitude of individuals who have approximately the same number of notions in regard to religion, history, science, political economy, legislation, and government. Where do they get it? From summaries, from a magazine article, from a newspaper article, right? Or today, from a YouTube clip. And some of them, I confess, are pretty helpful. I mean, I use them myself many times. But still, it's not the same as meditating deeply on a challenging book and letting your intellect grow and develop through slow, quiet reading. We are mediocre in our intellect. We're mediocre in our tastes. And we're fine with that. Anybody really object? Well, what does this do to us? Let's consider the case of contemplation of great art. Take Michelangelo's David, Da Vinci's Last Supper. What is it about these works that are so extraordinary? If you study them carefully, you learn that they have these mathematical proportions to them, that you grow as a person by meditating on these works, by looking at them from different angles. Sometimes it takes a good art historian to explain to you what's going on. But once you get it, you go, wow, they demand things of you. They demand your contemplation and your careful attention. They demand that your soul live up to the excellence that's embodied in these works. Okay, is it like that in America? What do painters paint here? Let's consider art as an example of this. Well, it's well known in this era, and Tocqueville mentions this elsewhere in Democracy in America. If you want to eat and you're a painter, you're going to paint family portraits, and that's that. Not particularly inspiring. They don't raise serious questions about human meaning and existential existence. They make money. That's all they do because the families pay for them and they hang over the fireplace somewhere in someone's living room. But yeah, what are other examples of American art that might have more to them? There's propaganda, obviously. World War I poster, right, of Uncle Sam. I want you for the U.S. Army. But that was paid for by the federal government. That was propaganda. That was trying to get guys to enlist in the Army. And yet, in hindsight, even though it was propaganda, it's regarded today as great American art. Propaganda has a way of growing into excellence over time in unusual ways. But most of the time, what do we got? Pop culture, right? Look at that mess. Can you really say there's anything excellent or beautiful in any of that? It's just like this sensory overload. It makes you slightly nauseous. Does it do anything like what Michelangelo's David or Da Vinci's Last Supper does, or ancient Greek sculpture, or, no, it's just redundant. It's all made to sell. It's all advertisement driven, right? What's interesting is some American artists have meditated on this and kind of asked the question, what if there's some sort of excellence that can be derived out of it? But then again, it's all kind of redundancy, as Andy Warhol pointed out with Marilyn Monroe over and over and over again. Repackaged, repackaged, repackaged. So it seems in democratic times, we just lack the attention span for anything truly sublime or elevated. But hey, maybe it's not so bad, said Warhol. Maybe out of that will emerge a new kind of excellence, a democratic sense of excellence that rises above mediocrity. Will it? Well, let's consider some other painters. By the time Tocqueville was here, very famous painter who by day painted family portraits, but by night did some extraordinary works, like The Verdict of the People. This is by George Caleb Bingham, one of my favorite painters of this era. It's the outcome of an election, right? You see a guy calling out the outcome. You can kind of tell who the winner is, see the guy smiling. Democracy, there it is. Self-government, we're doing it. We're pulling it off. And yet in the foreground, who do you see? Who's the guy on the ground? A slave. And it's cut off at the bottom, sorry, but he's actually writing in the dirt with his finger. What does that remind you of? Think back to the Bible when in the New Testament, when the Pharisees catch the woman in the act of adultery and bring her to Jesus. That's the law says we must stone her. And Jesus picks up a rock and says, whoever's without sin, cast the first stone. Remember that? None of them cast the stone. But then Jesus does something unusual. He gets down on the ground and he writes in the dirt with his finger. The common interpretation of that is that he's writing the sins of each of the Pharisees in the dirt. Pride, lust, greed, whatever. Probably pride mostly. Well, so it is here. The slave, writing the sins of America in all of its glory in the dirt. Slavery. Bingham had some more lighthearted ones. The riverboat dance, on the serene images on the Mississippi. The joy of the frontier and of life and kind of just the democratic sentiments that have saturated American society. Where's class in this picture? Where's the superior and inferior? You can't really tell. And again, meditations on the frontier. Look at that serene image, the two boatmen going up or down the Mississippi. Where are they going? Where do they come from? What does it mean, right, to be on this course of history symbolized by the river? In fact, in the Declaration of Independence, right, when in the course of human events, the word course in that era, well into the 1800s, it usually meant a river. That human history flows like a river and it twists and turns. Where is it coming from? Where does it go? And where are we on it? And my real question is, how did they get that cat on a leash? I don't know. Anyway, this one's great. This guy, obviously of old, Anglo-European stock, but, what is class to him? What is being noble? What is being common? It means nothing. Who is he? He's a citizen. And as humble as he is, and as hardworking as he is on one of those riverboats, he's a free man. Here's a funny one. I love this. It's called The Sportsman's Last Visit, 1836 or something like that. Here's the sportsman. You can tell who he is, rifle leaning against the wall. He's been out with the boys hunting, right? Comes home to see his girlfriend, and some other guy is visiting her. Who's he? He's dressed very nicely in a suit. He looks very European, in fact. What's it going to be? Old world aristocratic manners and customs. He's very gentlemanly, right? Or rough and tumble American democracy. One interpretation of this painting is that's actually Lady Liberty. Which is she going to choose? Is she going to dump the old American boyfriend for the European one and go back to a sense of honor and aristocratic order? So yeah, this one's quite funny. That's just the look on the sportsman's face, like, what did I do wrong? Here's a part one, part two by another painter called William Sidney Mount, called Negotiation for the Sale of a Horse, part one. And here's part two. The same guys. And in those days, when you engaged in conversation, you often pulled out a pocket knife and whittled a stick and kind of had a roundabout way of talking about things. And you can tell these two guys have traded places in terms of their fortunes, right? The top hat and the guy in the red vest is replaced by a straw hat. What's happened to him? The horse is sold, the horse is bought back, right? Because somebody is down and out. You see the collapsed roof on the barn too up there indicates that the estate is kind of falling apart. This is the result of those inheritance laws that Tocqueville mentions. Fortunes change hands, wealth rises and falls. Mount has a really famous one. Um, I forget the title, but it's taking a break from the harvest or something like that. There's a slave with a bunch of kids, white kids who work the farm. He's one slave, right? Instead of a huge plantation of slaves. But what's happening? The kid is tickling his ear with a piece of wheat. It's symbolic of what happens when the slave wakes up. What happens when the slave asserts his freedom and his dignity? That could be a very, very dangerous situation, but it's coming. The fear of a slave revolt was very real, and Tocqueville will have things to say about that later. Here's a great one on gold in California. The title is something like that. Look at those faces. Gold. I'm going to be rich. I'm going to be set for life. Everyone's just ecstatic about this. And there's the announcement of the Lu Chu, a ship going from somewhere in the East Coast to San Francisco. And you can go out in Central Valley and just pick gold up off the ground. Looming over all of this is a rifle. How did the California gold rush go? It was the Wild West. It was really violent. Claim jumping and people just shooting each other over gold. Gold drives people crazy. Greed drives people crazy. And all the hope and euphoria is just going to blow up. Meanwhile, the slave is in the background thinking, whatever, right? Mount had some wonderful ones, though, musicians and dancers. I love these. Common thing in the 19th century, the fiddle always comes out, right? Today you play your music on your Bluetooth speaker. Back then you played the fiddle or the acoustic instruments, the drumsticks or whatever. What is it about music that transcends the mundane and sometimes even transcends great suffering and grief? How is it that music pulls us out of ourselves? Even injustices as profound and monstrous as slavery, music somehow puts us in tune with something eternally beautiful and good and pulls us out of our suffering and even the worst injustice. Mount painted these slave portraits of slave musicians, the banjo player, the fiddler, and the bone player. Bones are like castanets. And just the eyes looking beyond at something great, suffering of slavery, and yet the joy of music. Mount was wonderful about that. Other famous American paintings that seem to show that maybe there really is a kind of democratic excellence, that it's not all just mediocre. Winslow Homer's famous painting, right after the Civil War, of a slave on board a ship with a broken mast surrounded by sharks. What's going on here? The slaves are liberated, Emancipation Proclamation, Civil War ends, right? And for a while, Union troops are in the South protecting them, and they have the right to vote, and their civil liberties protected against organizations like the Ku Klux Klan. But then what? Union troops withdraw by 1877, and now the slave is on his own, surrounded by sharks, symbolic of Klansmen, I assume. Very thoughtful painting. Here's another famous one you've probably seen, James Whistler, and the title is Whistler's Mother from 1871. Supposedly a model was supposed to show up for a picture, and she bailed out. So Whistler asked his mom to sit in a chair, and he painted her, and it became one of the most famous paintings in American history, capturing again the sense of old age in modern times. What is the sense of past and continuity and future exactly? Another one I'm sure you've seen before, Grant Wood's American Gothic. Guess what year it's from? You look at this and, oh, it's got to be from the 1800s. Nope, it's from 1930. What's the message here? Somebody's come home to the farm from the big city, partied a little too hard during the 1920s, lost a bunch of money when the stock market crashed and the Great Depression. Look at that farmer's face. Shame on you. Shame on America for living such a way. Let's go back to our simple, humble country roots. So, anyway, that's just kind of a survey of great American art. Um, is it all mediocre? Or is there a democratic kind of excellence that rises above all of that? Fascinating question. And I think art critics and art historians have never really gotten to the bottom of it. But then again, what was it about aristocracy that made things so excellent? Was it because the consumers of the art actually could judge how excellent it was? Can't the many make such judgments better than the few? Maybe democracy can produce excellence that might even surpass the old world. I don't know. It's a lofty question. I'll leave it to you to consider. Chapter 4, though, he considers this idea of the sovereignty of the people. What does it mean to say the people are sovereign in such a way? Well, in the old world, as he points out, to assert the people and their sovereignty was dangerous business. You just didn't want to do that because that meant things like peasant revolts, that meant things like popular uprisings. It was always there, he says, but it was buried. The people were always the people and they were always there. They always had a sense of their own sovereignty. But still, every time they rose up and asserted that sovereignty, they were plunged back into the shadows of the sanctuary, as he put it there on page 42. Um, what was worse, though, is popular sovereignty was especially dangerous, specifically because it was the stuff that demagogues would mess with. Demagogues whipping the people into a frenzy of popular passions and vengeance and all this kind of stuff. People like Julius Caesar, people like Pisistratus of Athens. Think back to Plato, right? Isn't that what he said always happens to democracy over time? If you let it run its course, you always end up with a demagogue who manipulates the people and then becomes a tyrant, right? So much better to maintain order through monarchy, through aristocracy, or something. So you don't end up with these mobs of people who assert their power, tear everything down, and then have no idea how to govern themselves and run into the arms of a tyrant. So much better to have a king, so much better to have an aristocracy, they said. And as a result, the people remained silent and submissive, fearful of power, but fearful of themselves too, and willing to submit. But then what happens? The American Revolution, right? Once again, makes the sovereignty of the people public for the first time. I mean, you got to think like, what's the difference between the revolutionary soldier patriotically, joining General Washington's army and marching off to fight the British, and a bunch of peasant rabble? What is the difference other than muskets versus axes? What's the real difference between these guys and a peasant revolt in the Middle Ages? Well, Tocqueville says there's a substantial difference because these guys had the mores. They were prepared for their freedom. They were willing to assert their ability to do democracy, specifically because they had the moral qualities in their hearts that made them capable of it. It wasn't perfect, but it was much stronger than it was for peasants in the old world. Plus, did they have demagogues? They could have, but they didn't. Instead, they had George Washington, selfless model of self-control, surrendering power. Remember, 3 times in his life we talked about earlier, and gave it up every single time. If it weren't for that, you could have seen these guys turn into a real rabble, and then you could have seen a demagogue come along, and that would have been it. And America would have transitioned right away into some kind of military dictatorship of some kind or another. But instead, yeah, he says in America, page 42, the principle of the sovereignty of the people is not hidden, nor is it sterile as it is among certain nations. It is recognized by the mores, once again, those moral habits, and proclaimed by the laws. It expands with liberty, and it attains its ultimate consequences without obstacles. It therefore is a single country in the world where one may hope to appreciate on its just merits the dogma of the sovereignty of the people, to study in its application to the affairs of society, and to judge its advantages and dangers. The country is it that if you want to study it, that country is assuredly America, he says. Sovereignty of the people is public, it's out there, and it's present, and it works because the people learn self-restraint. And there's a lot of factors that contribute to that. Certainly the leadership of Washington, also religion, also private property and rights, but just the general moral framework in which these people think makes them way more capable of self-government than peasants of the Middle Ages ever were. A few obstacles in the way, as he points out, right? But they were quickly overcome. The fact that the American founders, like we said a minute ago, were willing to surrender their own elite position in society to the people. And they could do it trusting the people. In fact, they identified the sovereign as the people, like we said a minute ago, in the opening line of the Constitution itself. We, the people, that's the sovereign here in the civil authority. And there was also the fact that, as he points out, universal suffrage became the next step. Elites submitted and they made concessions to the people, but then right away, the people made even bigger concessions. It's one thing to say that the people will have the right to elect their officials, that the people will ratify the Constitution, like we talked about earlier. It's another thing to say that everybody's going to be allowed to vote, but that's ultimately where it led. The Constitution has no property qualifications. It doesn't forbid anyone from voting. Everyone is allowed to vote. States would place restrictions, obviously on slaves and many freed blacks in the North, obviously on women, not allowed, not allowed, Native Americans, not allowed. But still, those were state decisions. It didn't take long after the Constitution to see states granting more and more grants of universal suffrage. The property qualification was the first thing to drop away. Soon, women would be allowed to vote, as we know. Blacks would be allowed to vote at the end of the Civil War. It would take the Civil Rights Act to complete it in the 1960s. But still, it's this progressive movement of encompassing more and more and more voters to the point where everybody's allowed to vote today, except for non-citizens and convicted felons, right? That's it. So, yeah, universal suffrage is kind of the final step. But then he says something really amazing on page 44. There are countries where a power, in a way external to the social body, acts on it and forces it to march a certain path. Power can exercise all this force over the people from the top. It is not like that in American democracy. There are others, he says, where force is divided, being placed at one and the same time in the society and outside of it. But nothing like this is seen in the United States because there, society acts by itself on itself. What is he describing there? It sounds kind of like the general will. Remember Jean-Jacques Rousseau and the way he understood that? But the major difference is what? Rousseau thought you achieved the general will through all kinds of power and manipulation by the legislator. Remember, people have to be forced to be free and all of that. No, this general will emerges spontaneously, and it emerges within the framework of law. So, in a way, it's Rousseauian, but in a way, it's not. Power exists only within it. One comes across almost nobody who dares to conceive and, above all, express the idea of seeking it anywhere else. The people take part in composing the laws by choosing the legislators and, in their application, by electing the agents of the executive power. The fact that they vote for the president, Tocqueville says, is amazing. That's just unheard of in the old world. People might vote for members of parliament and vote for a party, but you never choose the executive. But no, in America, we do. One can say that the people governs itself so much so much is the share left to the administration weak and restricted, and so much does the latter feel the influence of popular origin and obey the power from which it emanates. So even though we have these elected officials in Congress, the presidency, our state legislators, our city council, they always know who their boss truly is. It's us, right? It's we the people who exercise that authority. They always must go back and get themselves reelected. They must make their case for why they deserve 4 more years, 2 more years, whatever it is. At the end of the day, we're the employers. We are the ones who choose who our officials will be. And public officials consent to that, no matter how powerful and ambitious they are. The people reign over America, he says, the American political world, like God governs the universe. It is the cause and the end of all things, and everything emerges from it, and everything is absorbed into it. Right? The voice of the people, it turns out, is like the voice of God. Now, right away, that's when you start to say, hold on a second. Is that really such a good idea? I mean, do we basically worship ourselves as a collective community? Is that the way it works in American democracy? What about the transcendence of Christianity? And as we'll see later, Tocqueville will say, yeah, you're right to be worried about that. Because there is the possibility that religion, like real religion, like Christian faith, might be absorbed into democracy to the point where people can't really distinguish between what's transcendent and what's just a product of democratic society. So we'll get back to that later. Tocqueville just kind of leaves you hanging there, but he'll come back to the real problems of what he calls tyranny of the majority later. A couple chapters I didn't assign. Um, Chapter 5, he devotes a great deal of attention to local government, which he kind of addressed already, but it's the heritage of the Puritan town hall meeting, the township, the way that they deal with so many local affairs. There's so many local officials who are very close to the people. He has a lot to say about what he calls administrative decentralization on page 55. And that has to do with the fact that even though we have a national union, the way it runs, the way it operates is very decentralized. It's very local. And so he'll explain more about that later. So I didn't assign this chapter. Chapter 6 is on the judicial power. And he marvels at the way that even though democracy is so powerful, the majority rule every time, the fact that the people are sovereign, there is still a very strong willingness in the people to trust law and to trust courts and due process of law in those courts. And that's amazing, he says. The fact that the courts really can stop the people from jumping off a cliff and doing crazy things, right? That's actually quite valuable for keeping democracy healthy. But chapter 8, he turns to the major aspects of the federal constitution. And the one thing that really stands out for him is federalism, which we talked about earlier, separation of powers between state and national governments. But he observes this, that there are two different national types, two different types of nations, you might say. And what are they on page 68? Small ones and big ones. Small nations, he points out, tend to be free and happier. And they're tighter communities. So places like early Rome in the Roman Republic, just taking Rome as my example. So yeah, what are these like? They're free because they are more tightly knit. They are a closer community. Plus, tyranny does show up sometimes, but tyranny is easily squashed. There's the conspiracy of Catiline in the Roman Senate, and there he is sitting in the corner by himself, right? Tyranny is always a looming possibility, and yet it's easily gotten rid of. Big republics, on the other hand, or big nations in general, they are glorious and strong, but that often comes at the cost of freedom and happiness. So it's a tricky balance between being small and being large. There's advantages to both. But what have the Americans done that's so unusual, as he says on page 69, after comparing the two? Or, sorry, on page 70, I meant. Americans have successfully balanced these two qualities of other nations into one. Do we have small nations? Do we have both a small nation and a large nation? We do. The small nations are the states. The large nation is, of course, the Union. I showed you this before. We talked about federalism and the Constitution, but that's the general idea. All those states are local governments, and within them are even more local governments of cities and municipalities and counties, not to mention school boards and water departments and universities and all kinds of little governments within one big union. What's the balance of power between these? It's tricky, and it's a long story figuring out exactly how the United States has done this. The Supreme Court has had to rule again and again on the question. But yeah, it's either federal and local or it's national. Americans are they combine the qualities of both national power and local power. How does he describe this? There's Congress, as Tocqueville would have seen it in 1830. The original dome was made of steel, so instead of those big white pillars and dome like we have today. And then there's the local town hall. He says that national government is over general things, the most general national concerns, right? And the two biggest ones are obviously defense and commerce, regulation of commerce between states, and any other national needs that come up. But he says there aren't very many because the Union, the powers of the Constitution given to Congress, only deal with very specific things. James Madison described it well. He said that the powers given to Congress are few and defined. Meanwhile, those left to the states are numerous and indefinite. Local government is in charge of particular things, social problems like poverty and substance abuse and just mundane administrative stuff like driver's licenses and traffic laws, education, public welfare. These are all local concerns. And the list is way, way longer. I only listed three things here, but I mean, the list is much longer under local government than it is under national government. At least, historically it has been. Now, as we know, that changes over time, and the national government does become more and more involved in local things. But still, I mean, we have states, we have local governments, and we said before, most of the laws you come into contact with day to day are local. If you're pulled over for speeding, does a federal agent stop you? No, a state trooper does, or maybe a city cop if you're downtown, right? But yeah, it's all local, local. Everything is local. It's very rare to meet a federal agent. In Tocqueville's day, the only federal government employee you would ever meet would be a postal worker, and that would be it. Everybody else was off in DC or maybe federal offices in state capitals. You see the one here in Bismarck, right? That's a fascinating thing, Tocqueville says. As a result of this, the American system is very resilient. It extends the sphere to a variety of interests. It calms the passions. We get really emotional about national issues, right? But really, we're more concerned about local affairs. It's the school board meeting that really stokes your anger, your concern. It's affairs at the university that really gets your attention, right? And national affairs are we're kind of spectators to that. It's far away. Our local affairs are right in front of us. Um, he points out too that this allows the national government a lot more flexibility to do the things it needs to do. It eases the burden on its responsibility. Congress is only in charge of, like we said, defense and regulation of commerce, things that are absolutely necessary, he says on page 70. And so, because who's left to manage everything else? It's the local governments. Imagine if Congress was entrusted with governing the entire country in all of its minute details. Imagine if going to the DMV meant going to a federal office. That'd be an absolute nightmare. It's bad enough as it is, right? Thankfully, um, driver's licenses, vehicle registration is a local concern and not a federal one. And so Tocqueville absolutely marvels at this. It allows us to have this economic self-reliance and the fact that we have all this trade between the states and everything, not having to depend on other countries. But at the same time, we have that quality of a big nation mixed together with local government over local affairs. So in all, yeah, the federalism, as he calls it, unites both local and national systems into one. He says on page 71 in the middle, the disadvantage does not exist in the disadvantage of big unified nations. It does not exist in confederations like the United States. The Congress decides on the principal acts which regulate the life of society. All of the details are left to provincial legislation, local governments. One cannot imagine what extent this division of sovereignty serves the well-being of each of the states which compose the Union. In these small societies, which are not preoccupied with the care for defending or enlarging themselves, all public power and all individual energy are turned toward internal improvements. And that's an old-fashioned term for just local affairs and local concerns. So, yeah, the fact that states don't have to fight wars, only the US Army does. Well, that means they're allowed to spend a lot more of their money and devote more of their attention to just taking care of themselves. These central governments of each state being placed right beside the governed, right? They're close to the people, right? Is alerted daily to needs which make themselves felt. One therefore sees new plans presented every year, which discussed in the municipal assemblies or before the legislature of the state, and then reproduced by the press, excite the universal interest and zeal of citizens. And we care a lot more about that than we do about what goes on in Washington, D.C., or at least we should, Tocqueville says. This need to make improvements continually agitates American republics, but without troubling them, because they're able to pull it off themselves. This lack of federalism in other places, he says, where everything is national, is exactly why other countries struggle so much with democracy. So back to his general point, right? Democracy's coming. It's going to be everywhere, he says. It's a global phenomenon driven by the hand of God. How are you going to deal with it? This, he says, is one of the most important ways Americans have dealt with it well. Dividing up responsibility between national government on one side, state and local government on the other. He says specifically, the countries of South America, this is why they had such a hard time with democracy, even though they had very similar revolutions to the United States, declaring their independence from Mexico, Brazil from Portugal. Why is democracy so rough there? Because they can't seem to design governments that let local communities govern. They want to centralize everything. That's why it's so hard for them. Americans had a unique advantage because, of course, local government came first. The townships of old colonial days, the colonies that became states, then those formed the Union. It was a grassroots, bottom up kind of process that other countries didn't have. So that gave us a unique advantage. But what if other countries could adopt this kind of system, he wonders? What if France could decentralize? Don't let's all look to Paris to solve every problem, he says. Let's be more like the Americans and have city councils and local communities and local congregations that get together and figure out their own problems because they're the ones closest to it. This is what we do. I showed you this chart before from the 2010 census. I should update it. I'm sure it's about the same in 2020. But how many governments do we have in America? One federal government, of course, 50 states, and then 3,034 counties, right? As far as cities and towns, municipalities, 19,429. Even smaller townships. And that's what Tocqueville's really interested in, right? 16,504 that are run by just local city count or local town hall meetings. Then you have all the school districts, and then you have this huge miscellany of special purpose organizations: utility, fire, police, library, water district, and dry places. Universities you could include in that list. 35,052, leading us to a grand total of 87,576 governments. And the further you descend down between federal and special purpose, right, the more particular you see each one dealing with very specific things. Imagine if that one federal government at the top managed all the things that the little governments at the bottom manage. It would be a massive strain on the system. It would require millions of bureaucrats and very heavy-handed policies and a lot of really ineffective citizens who couldn't really govern themselves. But we don't do it that way. Americans do things themselves at the local level. And in saying this, he hasn't even gotten to interest groups yet. We'll get to them later. But wow, what does this mean ultimately when it comes to political philosophy? Think back to the difference between Aristotle and Hobbes. Remember those guys? Aristotle was all about the polis, the small community bound together, people who are political by nature and all of that, organizing their society together. Hobbes was all about the powerful nation state that depended on fear and force and focused on defense and order. Who's right? One or the other. But in America, it's both. Do we have a Hobbesian nation state? Yes, governed from the top by Congress and the presidency. At the same time, do we have a whole bunch of little polities, little polises across the land? Back to that chart. Yeah, we have 35,052 of them. Tocqueville is fascinated with this. How is it that Americans learn to combine these two things? Clearly, as he said at the beginning, we need a new political science for a world altogether new. He says at the end, the Union is free and happy like a small nation on one hand because of all the little, polises within it, but it's also glorious and strong like a big nation, like a great one. We are a nation and we are a bunch of cities all at once. So there's how it all works. There's its development and the way that it forms over time and the practices and institutions that Americans turn to. But Tocqueville has some concerns. How does the majority, how does democracy actually govern? It depends on a majority. What does that majority do? Can that majority be stopped if it really wants to get its way? No. What's the danger of tyranny of the majority? A very popular phrase that Tocqueville, I don't think he coined it, but he definitely popularized it. What does it do? How does it overrun everything? It's nice to say sovereignty of the people, but what happens when that sovereignty of the people misbehaves? I mean, if power corrupts, right? Isn't that just as true of multitudes as it is of individuals? And then his next question, what do you do about that? How do the Americans stop tyranny of the majority and do it very well? So yeah, chapters 7 and 8 deals with that question. See you next time.